Manchester United are in crisis. It's a statement that one could have made, broadly speaking, at any stage over the last 11 years, since Sir Alex Ferguson retired. Since Fergie hung up his hairdryer and his watch after reclaiming the Premier League title in the 2012-13 season by more than 10 points, Manchester United have failed to build upon the 13 Premier League titles he won over the preceding 21 seasons. The Red Devils have had 7 different managers over the last 11 years, including 2 caretakers, contrasted with just 1 manager for the preceding 27 years, and they have failed to come within 10 points of winning the Premier League title during that time, failing to even qualify for the Champions League on 6 occasions, whereas they never finished lower than 3rd during the Premier League era under Fergie. Even within that context, though, Manchester United's current predicament is an especially miserable one. Last season, in which Sir Jim Ratcliffe acquired a 27.7% stake in the club for £1.25 billion and took control of their football operations, the Red Devils finished in 8th place, their lowest league finish of the Premier League era, a massive 31 points behind the team that Ferguson once described as their noisy neighbours. That failure could hardly be ascribed to Ratcliffe, who only completed his investment in February, or the new team that he has assembled around him. But over the summer, Ratcliffe and his team had the opportunity to put their imprint on the club, outlining their ambition to return Manchester United to the top table of European football by making them, quote, the best in class in every regard. That has so far begun by trying and failing to convince anyone to replace Erik ten Hag, having the news of his imminent departure leaked before an FA Cup final, winning that FA Cup final, U-turning when all of their preferred candidates turned them down, thus undermining any authority that Erik ten Hag previously had, spending another €200 million and €100 million net over the summer, and proceeding to lose 3 of their first 6 Premier League games this season, including 3-0 defeats against both Liverpool and Tottenham, leaving them 13th in the Premier League table, and drawing 1-1 at home against FC Twente in the UEFA Conference League. Still, at least they battered Barnsley 7-0 in the EFL Cup. When Jim Ratcliffe arrived at Manchester United, he seemed to be sanctified in certain sections of the media. Ratcliffe was presented as an uber-competent and ruthless titan of industry who would return Manchester United to their former glories by professionalising their sporting operations, which, combined with an already very lucrative and well-run commercial arm, was destined to be a recipe for success. Almost everyone seemed to fall in line with this narrative. But why? Ratcliffe is a titan of industry, but that industry is petrochemicals, not super clubs, and the 2 football clubs that he already owned, and continues to own, have a mixed record under his stewardship at best, and a distinctly underwhelming one at worst. Even some of Ratcliffe's other sporting enterprises, like the INEOS Grenadiers cycling team, provide more questions than answers. So in today's video, I'm afraid we need to talk about Sir Jim Ratcliffe, both the man, the businessman, and the sporting executive, covering his investment in Manchester United, his intentions at the club, both stated and reported, and why the thumbnail of this video portrays him as a clown, accompanied by the word clown in size 144 font, just in case any of you were in any doubt as to whether or not I consider him to be a clown. Clown. Manchester United isn't the first football club that Jim Ratcliffe and INEOS, the conglomerate that he founded, chairs, and still majority owns, have invested in. Back in November 2017, at a time in which the value of INEOS was going through the roof, the company acquired Swiss Super League side FC Lausanne-Sport. 7-time Swiss champions and 9-time Swiss Cup winners, like Manchester United, albeit in a much more extreme sense, with their last major trophy coming all the way back in 1999, Lausanne-Sport were a fallen giant, which INEOS and Ratcliffe promised to return to their former glories. Upon acquiring the club, INEOS outlined their bold ambitions for Lausanne-Sport to compete once again within the Swiss Super League, having finished 9th the previous season, and to qualify for European football. They announced plans to establish 2 African football academies, one in Botswana and the other in Namibia, to develop junior players between the ages of 12 and 18, with a view to the most talented among them being brought to Switzerland, developed further in Europe, and ultimately representing Lausanne-Sport. This was presented as a cornerstone of INEOS's plans at Lausanne-Sport, discussed in the company's press release on their own website when they announced their takeover of the team, in which they stated that talks had already begun with Botswana and Namibia's governments. In the meantime, INEOS made Enzo Zidane, son of France legend Zinedine Zidane, their first signing, and stated that manager Fabio Celestini had their full support. In INEOS's first season owning Lausanne-Sport, the club was relegated and Celestini departed. Enzo Zidane was sent out on loan to Rayo Majadahonda following Lausanne-Sport's relegation, and he has, incidentally, just retired from football, aged 29, to focus on his other investments. I wonder if he's considered petrochemicals. I digress. Anyway, 7 years since Ratcliffe and INEOS bought Lausanne-Sport, the club still hasn't competed anywhere near the top end of the Swiss Super League table. They are yet to even come close to qualifying for Europe, and if they have opened any football academies in Botswana, Namibia, or anywhere else in Africa, they must be the best kept secret in Africa, because I've not seen anything about them since 2017, despite scouring the interweb and inquiring with all of my contacts in Namibia. Lausanne-Sport only returned to the Swiss Super League in the 2020-21 season. They were relegated again in 2021-22, marooned at the bottom of the table with only 22 points, almost half as many as the next lowest placed team in the division, and following a return in 2023, they narrowly avoided the relegation playoffs last season and are currently 1 point above them 8 games into this season at the time of this recording. So far then, so underwhelming. You might be wondering, why did Ratcliffe even want to own a Swiss Super League team? Even if INEOS had made a success of things, which they so far have not, it's not exactly the most lucrative or high-profile market for a businessman who had, at that time, just become the world's richest Briton. Well, things hadn't always gone quite so swimmingly for INEOS. Founded by Ratcliffe in 1998, the company nearly went bankrupt in 2009 at the height of the financial crisis. Ratcliffe managed to keep INEOS afloat, but in 2010, he asked the soon-departed Labour government for a £350 million tax deferral on VAT payments. Labour said no, so Ratcliffe packed up his toys and relocated his company's headquarters to Switzerland. Struggling under the weight of a £6 billion debt at the time, INEOS reportedly estimated that the move would save the company around €450 million in tax that they would otherwise have owed had they stayed in the UK. INEOS moved their headquarters back to Britain in December 2016, specifically to Knightsbridge in London, but remains an Anglo-Swiss business with offices and a significant footprint in Rueil, near Lausanne, hence the acquisition of the club. Lausanne-Sport are small fry within the grand football ecosystem though, and after repeatedly flirting with Chelsea, Manchester United and Newcastle United, and being less substantively linked with a couple of other Premier League clubs, Ratcliffe bought his second football club, Ligue 1 side OGC Nice, in July 2019. The €100 million price tag meant that Ratcliffe paid more for OGC Nice than Frank McCourt paid to acquire Marseille or the Qatari state paid to buy PSG, but once again, if you want to understand Ratcliffe's reasons for buying Nice rather than any other club, you must first understand just how much he hates paying tax. Ratcliffe may have moved INEOS's headquarters to Switzerland in 2010 to avoid paying a massive tax bill, but irritatingly, his personal wealth was still subject to UK taxation. Don't you just hate it when that happens? At this point, it is just worth addressing how rapidly INEOS's valuation rose during the mid-2010s, and therefore Ratcliffe's net worth, as the company's majority shareholder. Prior to the global financial crisis, which briefly reduced Ratcliffe's estimated fortune from the billions down to the hundreds of millions, the poor bastard, his net worth had peaked at an estimated £3.3 billion in 2007. Ratcliffe returned to the Billionaires Club again in late 2014, before his fortune grew rapidly, to $1.8 billion in 2015, $5.5 billion in 2016, $9 billion by 2017, and, by 2018, at least $16 billion. The Sunday Times Rich List put Ratcliffe's fortune by 2018 at over £20 billion, putting him top of their list of the wealthiest people in the United Kingdom, up from 18th place in 2017. It is an expensive business being that rich, so in September 2020, Ratcliffe changed his tax residence from his home in Hampshire, in the United Kingdom, to Monaco in Monaco. The move was reported as saving Ratcliffe a potential £4 billion in tax in the media, although given that Monaco has no personal income tax, no capital gains tax, and no inheritance tax, the amount that Ratcliffe could save is difficult to quantify, and could be much higher or even much lower than £4 billion, depending upon the success of INEOS and his other investments. If you are lost at this stage, I should point out that Nice is less than half an hour from Monaco, so just like Lausanne-Sport, INEOS and Ratcliffe's investment in OGC Nice was, at least in part, a marriage of convenience. There is another reason why Ratcliffe was happier to buy Lausanne-Sport and Nice than Premier League clubs that he was rumoured to be interested in at various points, and that is because they were much, much cheaper. Throughout his career, Ratcliffe has bought unloved or undervalued companies at discounted prices, cut costs, and made them more profitable. Whilst capital-intensive and heavy industry businesses became unfashionable in post-Thatcher Britain and unfavoured by the markets, as the country transitioned towards high-margin sectors like financial services, Ratcliffe took advantage of that undervaluing, becoming an entrepreneur at the age of 40 and buying up unfashionable businesses to build up his chemicals empire. INEOS financed most of those acquisitions through debt, secured against future earnings, most notably the $9 billion buyout of BP's worldwide olefins and derivatives business, which is why the financial crisis almost wiped them out. When it came to football, therefore, it seemed to be difficult for Ratcliffe and for INEOS to shift their way of thinking about valuations and value, and they balked at the multi-billion-pound price tags being quoted for the likes of Chelsea and Manchester United. Ratcliffe is genuinely a Manchester United fan. He was born and raised in Failsworth, 4 miles outside of Manchester, until his family relocated to East Yorkshire when he was 10 years old, and those close to him will tell you that he continued to follow the club closely throughout his life from that point on. He didn't let that get in the way of business, though. In 2018, with Manchester United not up for sale by the Glazers, it was widely reported that Ratcliffe had a £2 billion bid for Chelsea not backed by Roman Abramovich, preceding his takeover of Nice, and he tried again in 2022 after the Russian was sanctioned by the UK government and Chelsea were forcibly put up for sale, this time seeing a reported £4.25 billion proposal turned down, as Blueco emerged as the successful buyers. Clearly, by this stage, valuations had become less of an issue. The £2 billion that Ratcliffe had considered unreasonable in 2018 now looked like a bargain, and entering into his 70s, without wanting to sound too morbid, if Ratcliffe wanted to own a Premier League super team, he couldn't afford to wait around forever. Nonetheless, Manchester United are the most valuable privately owned football club on the planet, and despite initially appearing to entertain the idea of a full sale, it soon became clear that the Glazers' preferred option was to retain some ownership, and a majority ownership, as it turned out, and Ratcliffe was the only serious party willing to work within those confines. Ratcliffe may have sacrificed his first principle when it comes to valuation, but he immediately outlined his intention not to wiggle with regards to his second, which is what business executives like to call efficiency savings, and what normal people call cuts, often to their own jobs. Ratcliffe reportedly plans to axe 25% of Manchester United's overall workforce, roughly 250 people, in an effort to streamline the club's operations. The Red Devils have one of the largest payrolls in world football, above Liverpool, Real Madrid and Chelsea, and trailing only Barcelona and Bayern Munich. But, by the same token, it is just worth acknowledging that they are one of the biggest and most lucrative clubs on the planet, where cutting 250 jobs would give them a smaller workforce than Tottenham, Chelsea and Borussia Dortmund, all of whom have far more limited commercial revenue and operations than themselves. This is nothing new for either INEOS or Ratcliffe, though. INEOS used to be described as the most important company you've never heard of, meanwhile Ratcliffe was intensely private and kept a very low profile. That began to change in 2008, 4 years after INEOS had acquired BP's chemical business, which included the Grangemouth refinery in Scotland. INEOS claimed that Grangemouth, which is the only operating crude oil refinery in Scotland, wasn't very profitable, and that as a result, they would have to water down workers' paying conditions. INEOS proposed that plant workers, instead of having their pensions paid by their employers, as had been the case up to that point, would instead pay 6% of their salary towards their pensions. In response, 97% of the Unite Trade Union's 1,250 members at Grangemouth voted in favour of taking strike action. The industrial action cost the UK economy a reported £50 million a day, and after just 2 days, the strikers were victorious as Ratcliffe agreed to sit down with Unite and plant workers returned to their jobs. In 2013, however, INEOS claimed that Grangemouth was making losses and put a survival plan in front of employees, which forced them to accept worse employment terms. The Grangemouth employees rejected the offer from INEOS, but after INEOS responded by threatening to close the refinery, the unions were forced into a humiliating retreat, accepting INEOS's initial proposals in full in order to save jobs, and agreeing to a 3-year pay freeze and not to take any strike action for those 3 years. It was galling to some to see a billionaire who'd recently taken delivery of a new £120 million mega yacht called Hampshire 2 to go alongside his other mega yacht, Hampshire, forcing Scottish oil refinery workers to accept worse paying conditions, but it is exactly that ruthlessness which has seen Ratcliffe lauded within the world of business. Unusually, when Ratcliffe and INEOS arrived at OGC Nice, they adopted a lighter touch with their reforms and reorganisation, perhaps showing some humility when it came to their expertise in football, given how things had gone in their first season at Lausanne-Sport. When things started to go wrong, however, radical change was implemented under Bob Ratcliffe, Jim's brother, who was appointed CEO of INEOS Football and took a senior executive position at the club. At Manchester United, by contrast, INEOS and Ratcliffe's impact has been instant. Taking over the club's football operations from the Glazers, an area in which they were widely criticised and held responsible for the club's on-field decline, Ratcliffe appointed a new chief executive in Omar Barada, formerly of Manchester City, and a new chief finance officer in Roger Bell, who has been the CFO at INEOS for 23 years, with Dan Ashworth poached from Newcastle United after a prolonged saga as a sporting director, along with Jason Wilcox from Southampton as a technical director. Contrary to popular opinion, Manchester United isn't a money-making machine as a business. The club has posted a loss for 5 consecutive years, up to and including the 2023-24 season, adding up to a total loss of £358 million before tax during that time. Man United is a money-making machine for the Glazers due to dividend payments, which have been paused for the last couple of seasons, and principally because of the appreciation in the value of their assets, or their capital gain, exhibited by the £1.25 billion that they receive for 27.7% of the club, when Malcolm Glazer paid just £790 million, largely through debt leveraged against the club's own assets, for the whole thing between 2003 and 2005. The value of Manchester United has increased 5x during that time, despite the club themselves going from being the dominant force within English football and having recently won a treble to 6th and 8th place finishes in the last 3 seasons and not having got beyond the quarterfinals of the Champions League in over a decade. Also, contrary to what a lot of people seem to think, there hasn't yet been any sign of customary Ratcliffe cost-cutting to the club's bottom line. It is early days, of course, but other than the anticipated axing of 250 largely lower-paid jobs, Manchester United's wage bill and player amortisation actually rose by 10% last season, as the club recorded their highest ever loss in a season unaffected by COVID-19. And they have spent heavily once again in the summer just gone, €214 million gross and €103 million net. There has been a change, seemingly, in the profile of player Manchester United have targeted. The average age of the club's 6 summer signings was just 22, contrasted with signings like Casemiro, Rafael Varane and Cristiano Ronaldo in recent years, which largely turned out very badly for them, with massive outlays in terms of fees, wages or both, with absolutely no sell-on value in return. Despite the change of profile, however, and the sterner approach, when it came to saying no to deals when the price was too high, we haven't yet seen a drastic reduction in the club's wage bill, if indeed we even see one at all in the next set of published accounts. The biggest decision Ratcliffe and his team made in the summer, though, and what would so far appear to be the most disastrous, was in relation to the manager. Following a third-place finish in his debut campaign and an EFL Cup, for which he received plenty of plaudits, rightly, Erik ten Hag oversaw an 8th place finish last term in his second season at Old Trafford, which is Manchester United's lowest of the Premier League era. That seemingly, as was widely reported, made up INEOS and Ratcliffe's minds that Ten Hag had to go, in news that was leaked before an FA Cup final, but in a major upset, Ten Hag masterminded a 2-1 win against Pep Guardiola and Manchester City in the final to win his second trophy in 2 seasons. It didn't change the fact that Manchester United were abysmal most of last season, but after attempts to replace him proved to be more challenging than the club had anticipated, the decision was made to stick with Ten Hag. It was a total mess. You cannot publicly court managers, get rejected, stick with the current one, and then expect everything to go back to normal. It undermined any authority that Erik ten Hag still had with players, supporters, and, most importantly, any confidence that he had in his own job security and the faith of those above him in his own talents. Had it still been the Glazers calling the shots in a football respect, they would rightly have been lambasted for their amateurism and for showing a lack of class and respect. It should be no different with INEOS and Ratcliffe, who set Erik ten Hag and Manchester United up to fail this season before a ball had even been kicked. The other big issue that Ratcliffe has inherited at Manchester United, aside from the playing squad and the head coach, is the stadium. Ratcliffe has already unveiled plans for a £50 million refurbishment of Manchester United's Carrington training ground, but the stadium remains a bone of contention that is a lot trickier and more expensive to resolve. Ratcliffe favours building a brand new 100,000-seater £2 billion mega stadium next to Old Trafford, so that the Red Devils could continue to play at their old ground and maximise matchday revenue for the 6 years that he anticipates a new stadium would take to build, rather than renovating Old Trafford. Ratcliffe, who has described the proposed project as a Wembley of the North, believes that the stadium should be funded, at least in part, by central government. Just so that we're all clear here then, this is a man worth an estimated $15 to $30 billion who moved his company to Switzerland to avoid paying UK taxes in 2010 and moved his own tax residence to Monaco to avoid paying personal UK taxes in 2020, likely avoiding billions in taxes that could otherwise have been used to fund schools, hospitals, and other vital public services here in the UK. A country where 50 families now own more wealth than 50% of the population, that is, 33 million people, who owns 27.7% of a $6 billion asset, which generates over $700 million in annual revenue, and has spent almost $1.5 billion net on transfers over the last 10 years, but he wants the taxpayer, so not him definitionally, as a tax resident of Monaco, to cough up for a £2 billion stadium, the primary purpose of which will be to increase the multi-billion-dollar assets of multiple overseas multi-billionaires, namely him and the Glazers. With the best will in the world, Sir Jim, get fucked. Wembley is a state-owned asset, with its revenue from events to this day still serving its construction cost. This is a suggestion which ought to be laughed out of the room, of course, but Ratcliffe has cozied up to both the Tories and Labour in recent years, endorsing the latter after it became overwhelmingly obvious that they were going to win the last election, and taking out stands promoting his stadium proposals at both the recent Labour and Conservative Party conferences. And the UK government recently provided Ratcliffe with a €700 million guarantee to build the biggest petrochemical plant in Europe for 30 years, which is in Antwerp in Belgium, not in the UK, will turbocharge plastic production, and has been described as a carbon bomb by campaigners, so don't rule anything out. If I was in government, which you know I'm not because I bought my own clothes, I would say, sure, Sir Jim, we'll contribute to your regeneration plan and state-of-the-art new stadium, despite claiming there's no money left and that we must therefore continue with austerity, which has failed for the last 14 years but is bound to start working at some point. But if we're paying, say, £1 billion, we want to own half the stadium, or the equivalent of a £1 billion stake in Manchester United. A great man once said, when describing how they started out in business, and I quote, "Those were the old days of venture capitalism. They wanted you to put everything on the table. I quite like the philosophy. There is no such thing as a free lunch. A bit of commitment and responsibility is good." End quote. That man was Sir Jim Ratcliffe, or just Jim Ratcliffe as he was then, in an interview with the Financial Times in 2014. A wise sage indeed, I'm sure you'll all agree. There is no such thing as a free lunch, so surely that isn't what Ratcliffe expects. If his regeneration really is a benevolent plan for the north of England, motivated by a deep desire to level up a nation, where he no longer pays personal taxation, and he just needs the capital injection to get the project off the ground, why wouldn't he be happy to part with some equity in return? Ultimately, Jim Ratcliffe is a man who has amassed an enormous fortune in an industry which is actively destroying the only habitable planet humans currently have, whose company released caustic soda, which can cause severe burns to the eyes, skin, digestive system, and lungs, resulting in permanent damage or even death, into the Manchester Ship Canal in 2016, and had their environmental compliance approval suspended by the Ontario Ministry of the Environment in 2024 for excessive benzene emission levels, which can cause neurological effects, problems with the heart and lungs, and leukemia. But outside of that triumph, Ratcliffe's other endeavours haven't constituted the resounding success of a relentless winner that they are sometimes portrayed as being. Lausanne-Sport are still relegation contenders in the Swiss Super League, just as they were when INEOS bought them. They haven't challenged at the top end of the division or qualified for Europe. OGC Nice, despite Ratcliffe's 5-year plan for the club to challenge in Ligue 1 and become Champions League regulars, 5 years on, they haven't finished higher than 5th and haven't qualified for the Champions League. And the INEOS Grenadiers cycling team, who were relentlessly successful, albeit under something of a cloud as Team Sky, are now in crisis due to failures in recruitment and have been accused of having a toxic workplace culture. Even Ratcliffe's car company, INEOS Automotive, from which the INEOS Grenadiers take their name after the company's only current car, is an expensive flop, which Ratcliffe is so far reported to have sunk £1.4 billion into, yet the company's factory in Hambach, France, recently ground to a complete halt after one of its key suppliers ran into financial difficulties. It remains a distinct possibility, therefore, that when he ventures out beyond petrochemicals, Ratcliffe might not be quite the business genius that he is so often portrayed as being. If that is the case, then it begs the question, what next for Manchester United? A cornerstone of the INEOS and Ratcliffe project is reportedly something called Project 150, the name that is given to their ambition to win the Premier League title in 2028 to coincide with Manchester United's 150-year anniversary. We have been here before though. 3, 4 and 5 year plans are very easy to talk about. INEOS and Ratcliffe have done it at virtually every sports team they've owned, but delivering them is an altogether much more complicated task. In an era where wage expenditure correlates so strongly with points tallies and league finishes, purely by virtue of their revenue and wage bill, Manchester United should be a top 4 Premier League club almost every season, even if they were badly run. Anyone who delivers anything less than that then, I'm sure you'd agree, would therefore have to be a total and utter clown. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Should be some interesting ones, I'm sure. It goes without saying, even though I'm about to say it, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Threads via the username @HITC Sevens on all 3, should you wish to do so. And all of those links, plus a whole lot more good stuff, should be down in the video description below. Cheers.